The morning Dura Ironhide stumbled onto Harlan Holloway's land. She was bleeding from a gash above her left tusk, and carrying nothing but a satchel of seeds she had stolen from a burning clan camped 2 days north. Harlan was knee-deep in the east field, wrestling a stubborn root from ground that had been fighting him since spring, when he heard the creak of his fence rail bending under weight. He straightened up slow, the way a man does when he has learned that sudden movements in the frontier country can get him or someone else killed. What he saw along the fence line made him go still in an entirely different way. She was tall, nearly as tall as him, which already put her above most women he had ever known, and built with the kind of solid, deliberate strength that spoke of years of hard living and harder work. Her skin was a deep, earthy green, the color of old pine needles after rain, and her dark hair was pulled back from her face in a series of tight braids that had half come undone from whatever trouble had found her recently. She wore a fitted leather bodice laced tight up the front over a cream-colored linen shirt, the bodice following the lines of her figure with a practical closeness that was clearly meant for movement rather than ceremony, and dark travel trousers that tucked into boots worn at the heel. The gash above her left tusk was crusted over at the edges but still seeping at the center, and her jaw was set with the particular kind of determination that Harlan recognized as pride refusing to buckle in front of a stranger. She was gripping his fence rail with one hand to keep herself upright. That was the detail that undid him. Not the blood, not the fact that she was an orc woman alone on a human homestead, not the seeds she clutched in her other arm like a child. It was the white-knuckled grip on that rail, and the way her yellow-green eyes watched him with equal measures of wariness and exhaustion. He pulled himself out of the furrow and walked toward her without rushing. "You need water," he said. It wasn't a question. Her jaw tightened. "I am not asking for charity. I did not offer charity. I said you need water. That is just a medical observation." He stopped about 6 feet away, close enough to see that the gash was deeper than it looked from a distance, and far enough that she would not feel cornered. "My name is Harlan Holloway. This is my farm. You are welcome to the pump by the barn." She stared at him for a long moment, reading him the way prey reads a predator, or perhaps the way a very tired, very wary person reads any stranger in country that has not been kind to them lately. "Dura," she said finally. "Dura Ironhide. Pleased to meet you, Dura Ironhide." He turned and walked toward the barn, trusting that she would follow or she would not. After a few seconds, he heard the fence rail creak as she released it, and the careful, measured sound of boots on dry ground behind him. The Holloway farm sat at the edge of what local people called the Graymere Valley, a wide stretch of rough grassland and dark timber that ran between the Kettlehorn Mountains to the north and the Ashford River to the south. It was frontier country in the most honest sense, the kind of land where the nearest town was a half-day's ride, and your neighbors were close enough to wave to, but far enough that if something went badly wrong, you might not see another human face for a week. Harlan had worked the place alone for 3 years, since his father passed and left it to him. 300 acres of mixed field, meadow, and timber. A solid log barn, a root cellar, a modest log-end timber house that was warm in winter and cool enough in summer if you kept the windows open. He had 2 draft horses named Bell and Corker, a small herd of cattle, chickens that refused to stay where he put them, and a kitchen garden he tended with more care than he would ever admit to another man. It was a good farm. A full farm, honestly. Every building was occupied with some purpose, every field turned for something. But it had no room for another person. Not a barn loft already stacked with winter hay, not a house with 1 bedroom and a kitchen, not a root cellar packed to the ceiling with crocks and cured pork. When Dura Ironhide sat on the water trough edge and let him clean that gash with a clean cloth and a tin of the salve he kept for the horses, which, he told her honestly, worked better than the kind the general store sold, he found himself thinking about that for the first time. "How far back is the trouble you are running from?" he asked, not looking up from the wound. She was quiet long enough that he thought she was not going to answer. 2 days north," she said. "My clan's camp." The Ashfall men came through in force 3 nights ago. I was on night watch on the eastern edge. When I heard the fighting start, I ran for the supply tent first because we had been low on seed grain for the spring planting. By the time I got back to the main camp, she stopped. Harlan kept his hand steady. You don't have to finish that. There was nothing left to go back to, she said, in a voice that was flat and careful, the way a person's voice gets when the grief is too large to let out in public. I am the only one who ran east. I do not know what happened to the others. He sat back on his heels and looked up at her. She was looking at the middle distance, the satchel of seeds pressed against her side. Those seeds, he said, winter rye and red clover and some squash, a beet. It was all I could carry, he nodded slowly. Good choices. He stood up, dusting his knees. That wound is going to need to stay clean or it will sour. You should rest today. I have nowhere to rest. She said it plainly, without self-pity. That was somehow harder to hear than if she had said it with any emotion at all. Harlan looked around his yard, at the barn, at the root cellar, at his full, well-organized, already crowded farm. Then he looked at Dura Ironhide sitting on his water trough in the morning light with her careful braids coming undone, and a satchel of seeds she had carried through a burning camp for 2 days. And he felt something settle in his chest the way decisions sometimes do, not with a great noise, but with a quiet certainty. My farm has no room, he said. Not room that is fit for a person anyway. Her expression did not change. She had clearly been expecting that sentence to end with him pointing at the road. So I am going to build you one, he finished. She stared at him. For the first time since she had appeared on his fence, something shifted in those yellow-green eyes, not quite disbelief, not quite hope, but a complicated mixture of both. You do not know me, she said. No, but I know those are good seeds, and I know that gash needs a week of rest before you can put real strain on it without it opening up, and I know that it is April and the nights still get cold. He shrugged. I have the timber. I have the tools. I have done it before. A building in a week, she said slowly. A proper one. No, but a small one that is warm with a real door and a real floor. Yes, I have been meaning to put up a second storage structure anyway. I will just make it livable instead of just functional. He picked up his work gloves from the fence post. You can rest in the barn tonight. The hayloft is clear enough on the south end. There are blankets in the tack room. She was still staring at him with that complicated look. Why? She asked. He met her eyes. Because you needed water and I had a pump. Same principle. Harlan Holloway was 26 years old, brown-haired and built lean from years of farming. The kind of lean that was all rope muscle and weather-burnt skin rather than bulk. His face was angular, with a jaw that needed a shave more often than he got around to it, and eyes the color of creek water over dark stone, a deep, shifting gray-green. He was not a man of many words, which the frontier had mostly taught him, but when he spoke, he meant what he said. That, at least, was a thing Dura Ironhide learned about him quickly. She slept in the barn hayloft that night, curled in the blankets he left without ceremony, and when she woke in the small hours with the old nightmare sound still ringing in her ears, the shout of the Ashfall men, the crack of fire through canvas, she lay still and listened to the horses breathing below her and the soft creak of timber in the wind until her heart steadied. In the morning she came down and found Harlan already in the yard, working by lantern light because the sun had not yet cleared the kettle horns, studying a rough sketch he had made on a board with charcoal. 12 by 16, he said when he heard her approach. Single room, but a real hearth at the north wall. Floor joists above the ground so the cold cannot come up through the boards. Good overhang at the door side for weather. She looked at the sketch. It was not fine drafting, it was the kind of drawing a practical man makes for a practical purpose, but it was clear and well thought out. He had put a window on the east wall. Morning light, she thought, without meaning to. He had thought to give it morning light. I can work, she said. My shoulder is not so bad as, your shoulder is not what worries me. It is the gash, and the fact that it sits right where the muscle moves when you are lifting. He looked at her directly. You can do the laying and measuring. I will do the heavy carrying until that closes properly. She looked at him for a long moment and then nodded once, with the particular economy of a person who has accepted help without surrendering their dignity. Harlan seemed to understand exactly what that nod meant, because he handed her the measuring line without another word. They worked from first light. He felled 3 additional trees from the timber edge. She watched him handle the axe with a fluid, practiced rhythm that suggested he had been doing it so long he no longer thought about it. And she stripped branches and measured lengths while he notched and rough-hewed. The first day established a pace between them that required very little talking, because both of them were people who read a work situation well and found their place in it. What she did notice, and tried not to notice too consciously, was that he was an exceptionally considerate working partner. He never handed her a load she had not agreed to. He brought water without being asked, because he brought his own, and it was natural to bring 2 cups rather than 1. When she misjudged a measurement on the second bundle, she was rusty on the human unit system. Her clan used different markers. He simply said, "Here, let me show you the way I reckon it," without any of the condescension she had come to expect from human men when an orc woman misunderstood something. On the evening of the first day, he made supper. A thick stew with dried venison and root vegetables from the cellar, hardtack on the side, and a pot of something strong and dark he called camp coffee, which she suspected was mostly burned grain and determination, but was warm and bitter in a way she came to like immediately. They sat at the outdoor table he used in fair weather, and the valley spread out below the farm in the last gold of the day, and the kettle horns went purple against a pink sky, and it was, she had to acknowledge, a very beautiful piece of country. "How long have you been here?" she asked. "My father built the main house when I was 3, so 23 years, I suppose." He turned his cup in his hands. "He passed 3 years back. It has been just me since." She heard what was underneath that, not complaint, not self-pity, but the simple statement of a fact that had weight. "My clan was my family," she said. "My birth mother died when I was young. The clan raised me after that." There were 47 of us. The number hung in the spring air between them. He did not offer hollow comfort, he just let it sit and be the weight it was. "The seeds you took," he said eventually. "Winter rye, red clover, squash." She touched the satchel beside her. "My mother, the woman who raised me, our clan's head gardener, she had been saving the rye for 3 seasons to get a good strain. I could not leave it." "What is her name?" "Greca." A pause. Her name was Greca." He was quiet. "Then the rye will grow. You brought it this far." She looked at him. It was such a simple thing to say, and it was precisely the right thing, and she did not entirely trust herself to speak for a moment. "Yes," she said, "it will grow." By the 3rd day, the walls were going up. He had chosen a site 20 yards east of the barn, on slightly elevated ground so water would drain away from the foundation, sheltered on the north side by a stand of mature pines that would break the winter wind. He worked with a focused, unhurried intensity that she found herself matching, not because he asked her to keep his pace, but because there was something in the rhythm of building alongside someone that naturally synchronized you. She had to admit, impressed by how quickly he worked and how well he thought ahead. He did not simply build, he anticipated. He set the door post an extra hand width thicker than strictly necessary because, he explained without being asked, a heavy door hung on a light post would sag inside 2 winters. He cut the window frame with a slight outward lean so rainwater would shed away from the sill. He packed the spaces between the floor joists with dry grass and clay, which she recognized as good insulation even if the method was different from what her clan used. "You have built before," she said, on the 3rd afternoon. 3 times. "The barn I rebuilt after a fire when I was 18. The root cellar extension the year after that. A small shelter for the cattle last winter." He was fitting the lintel beam with careful attention. "You get faster each time, but the principles do not change. In my clan, building is communal. When someone needed a new lodge, everyone helped. You could put up a good-sized structure in 2 days with 20 pairs of hands." "That sounds better than one pair of hands," he said, which made her laugh before she could think about it. It was the first time she had laughed since the camp. The sound surprised her. It seemed to surprise him too, because he looked up quickly and something happened in his gray-green eyes, something warm and fleeting that he covered by going back to the lintel beam, but not quite fast enough. She did not examine the feeling that had prompted the laugh. Not yet. She filed it away somewhere careful. On the fourth day, two things happened. The first was that a rider came up the trail from the direction of Ashford, the nearest town, half a day's ride south, and pulled his horse up at the edge of Harlan's fence with the particular posture of a man who considers himself to be performing a public service by being somewhere he was not invited. His name was Tomas Cray. Harlan knew him, had done business with him at the feed store, had eaten at his table once at a town gathering, had found him to be the kind of man who had an opinion about everything, and the confidence of someone who had never examined his opinions very closely. He was broad-shouldered and red-faced and roughly 40, and he stared at Dura with an expression that moved through surprise, distaste, and a kind of territorial outrage in about 3 seconds. "Holloway," he said, not looking away from Dura. "There is talk in town about an orc raiding band moving south from the Kettlehorns. You know anything about this?" Harlan set down the axe he was using to fit a wall log. He did not hurry, but he walked to the fence with a calm, deliberate stride and stood between Cray's horse and Dura, who had stopped working and was watching from across the yard. "I know there was a clan camp north of here that was attacked 3 nights ago," Harlan said, his voice even, "by the Ashfall men from the sounds of it. This woman is the only survivor I am aware of. She is my guest." Cray's eyes finally moved to Harlan. "Your guest," he repeated, with a particular tone that tried to make 2 words into an insult. "My guest," Harlan said. "Dura Ironhide. She has been here 4 days and has not raided anything except my nail stores because we have been building." He tilted his head toward the rising structure behind him. "If you have news from town about the Ashfall men moving south, I would appreciate it. If you came out here to tell me who I can and cannot have on my own land, you can turn your horse around." The silence between them had weight. Cray looked past Harlan to Dura again, who was standing absolutely still with the measuring line in her hands, and his expression was unpleasant in a way that Harlan had seen on men's faces before, the expression of someone who wanted to say more but understood, somewhere in the back of their calculation, that they were on someone else's land and in the wrong. "Town is nervous," Cray said finally, pulling his horse's head around. "You should be too." "I will keep that in mind," Harlan said. He stood at the fence until Cray was over the hill and out of sight. Then he turned back to the yard. Dura had not moved. Her jaw was set in that familiar hard way, and her eyes were tracking him as he walked back toward her. "You did not have to do that," she said when he was close enough. "I know." He picked up his axe. "But I did want to." She looked at him for a moment longer than was entirely conversational, and then she went back to the measuring line without another word. But the set of her jaw had changed. The hard line of pride under pressure had shifted into something quieter, something she was not ready to name yet. The second thing that happened on the 4th day was simpler and entirely private. He came to the barn at dusk to check on Bell and Corker, and found Dura sitting in the open door of the hayloft, her legs hanging over the edge, watching the last light go off the valley. The braid she wore on the right side had come all the way undone, and her dark hair fell loose across her shoulder. She had not noticed him yet, and in that unguarded moment she looked neither wary nor determined. She looked like a person sitting with their grief in the quiet, which was a thing he understood very well. He went about his business with the horses and gave her the privacy of the moment without making it obvious that he was doing so. When he came back out into the yard, she called down softly, "Harlan." He looked up. "Thank you," she said, "for what you said to that man, and for all of it." He looked at her for a moment in the last of the light. "You carried seeds through a burning camp 2 days north of anywhere," he said. "The least the world owes you is a place to plant them." She was quiet. Then she nodded once with great care and turned back to the valley. He went inside and cooked supper with a feeling in his chest that he had not had in a long time and was not sure, yet, what to do with. On the 5th day, the roof framing went up. He was good at this part, had always had a feel for the geometry of it, the way the angles had to trust each other. Dura worked on the floor inside, laying boards with a precision that came from having watched and measured and thought about it for 4 days, without being able to do the heavier laying. She was not formally trained in construction, but she was intelligent and spatial, and she learned by observation. And by the time the last floor board was in place, she had done it as cleanly as he could have. He came down from the roof frame in the late afternoon and walked inside and crouched to check the floor she had laid, running his hand along the joints. "Not a gap," he said, with genuine appreciation. "Not a single one." She was still on her knees at the far end, checking the edge boards. She looked up. The late afternoon light came through the east window frame, not glazed yet, but open, and fell across her face and the loose tendrils of hair that had come free from her braids. And Harlan was aware, with sudden and total clarity, that she was extraordinarily beautiful. He had noticed, in the abstract, practical way one notices things, that she was striking. He had not until that moment felt it in the full physical way that he felt it now, the particular beauty of her, the green of her skin in warm light, the strong lines of her face with the small curved tusks that gave her profile something noble and fierce, the warmth in her yellow-green eyes that she usually kept guarded but that opened briefly when she was pleased with her own work. He stood up and looked at the window frame. "Glazed glass is expensive at the trading post," he said, quite steadily. "But I have some oiled parchment that will let light through and keep the wind out until you can afford glass. I will learn to trade here," she said, also quite steadily. "I can work." "You can do anything you set your mind to, I think," he said, and this time he could feel that he meant it in more than the practical sense, and he thought perhaps she could hear that, because she looked at him for a moment before looking back at the floor boards. That evening he glazed the window with oiled parchment stretched on a frame of thin split wood, and it let in the low gold of the sunset, and the small room glowed. On the 6th day, they built the hearth. This was the part he had thought about most carefully, because a hearth built wrong is worse than no hearth at all. He had brought the stone up from the river 2 weeks back for a different purpose, and changed the plan without explanation. She mixed the mortar, a recipe she actually knew better than him. She told him, because Orc clan hearths were built with a specific clay-ensemble ratio that lasted better than pure lime mortar, and he was entirely willing to defer to her expertise and said so, which appeared to momentarily startle her. "You are trusting an Orc woman about stonework on your homestead," she observed. "You said you know this. I do not know it better. That seems like a good enough reason to me." She studied him. Most human men would not say that. Most human men have not had the chance to build a hearth with someone who knows the correct clay ratio. He shrugged. "I am interested in having the hearth work. Everything else is secondary." She looked at him with the particular expression she sometimes got, layered, thoughtful, considering him from multiple angles at once, and then she demonstrated the mortar consistency without further comment. But he could see, in the way she worked with more ease after that, that something had relaxed in her. The hearth took most of the day and into the early evening, and when it was done it was solid and deep, with a good throat and a proper ledge, and they lit a small fire in it as a test and sat back on their heels and watched the smoke pull upward exactly as it should. "It works," she said, with a satisfaction so complete that it was almost like hearing her laugh again, that sudden unguarded quality that her careful exterior only let through in moments of genuine pleasure. "Of course it works," he said. "We built it." She looked sideways at him, close as they were in the small room, kneeling side by side in the firelight, and the corner of her mouth turned up in a way that was not quite a smile but was on its way toward becoming one, and he felt the warmth of the small fire and also the warmth of being close to her, and he thought it was probably best if he went and fetched water before he did something inadvisable. He went and fetched water. He also fetched supper. They ate it inside the new building for the first time, sitting on the floor with the fire going small and warm, and outside the spring night made itself known with the sound of peepers from the creek, and the horses were quiet in the barn, and it was in its way one of the finest evenings Harlan Holloway had spent in 3 years of farming alone. On the seventh day, he fitted the door. A door, in Harlan's considered opinion, was the most important part of any structure, because a door was the thing that said this is a place I can choose to open, and I can choose to close, and it belongs to me. He had made it from the densest wood in the lot, a heavy-grained piece that he had split carefully and planed smooth, with good hinges that had a satisfying weight to them and a proper iron latch that locked from inside. He hung it in the late morning. It swung clean and closed with a solid sound, and the latch seated itself on the first try, and he was unreasonably pleased about this. Dura stood in the doorway and tested it herself, opening, closing, feeling the weight of it in her hand. Then she looked at him standing in the yard. "You built this in a week," she said. "Roughly, yes." She was quiet. The spring sunlight was full on her face and the leather bodice and the braid that she had redone properly that morning, and she was looking at him with an expression he had not seen from her yet, not the wariness, not the careful gratitude, not the professional consideration of a working partner. Something more private and open than any of those. "Why?" she asked again. The same word she had asked on the first day, but different now, deeper, asking a different version of the question. He took a breath. "Because someone who carries seeds through a burning camp and measures floor boards by hand and knows the right clay for a hearth and laughs when she is surprised by something, that someone deserves a place to be." He held her gaze. "And because I wanted to build it, I wanted there to be a reason to keep you close." The silence between them held something entirely new. She stepped down from the doorstep and walked across the yard until she was 3 feet from him, and she looked up at him. She was an inch shorter, he had noticed, which still put her at a height that met his eyes nearly level, and she said, "I am not an easy person to keep close." "I am not an easy person to share land with," he answered. "I have seen no evidence of that. I have seen no evidence of the other thing either." Another silence, but warm this time. She reached out and touched the front edge of his collar, a small, deliberate gesture, her fingertips at the fold of weathered linen, and said quietly, "I think you are a very strange man, Harlan Holloway." "Yes," he agreed, "probably." She let her hand drop, but her eyes did not drop. He could feel his own heartbeat in a way that had nothing to do with the morning's labor. "Thank you for my door," she said. "Thank you for the hearth mortar." That broke something in her expression, and the not-quite smile became an actual one, full and real, with the light in her yellow-green eyes going warm and wide, and her tusks curving up at the corners of a smile that was fierce and genuine, and privately his for that one unguarded moment. He thought about it for a long time afterward. The week became 2 weeks, and then a month. Dura planted the seeds, the winter rye in the field Harlan offered without being asked, the clover along the meadow edge, the squash in a patch beside the east side of her new building where the sun would hit it. She learned the rhythm of the farm with the same quick spatial intelligence she had applied to the floorboards, and she brought to it a set of skills and knowledge that complemented what Harlan knew rather than duplicating it. She knew things about soil and growing that he did not. Her clan had been seasonal cultivators for generations, and she had a way of reading the ground, pressing her hand flat against it, smelling it, watching how water moved across it after rain, that told her things he would have had to wait and discover the hard way. She told him about a corner of the eastern field where the clay sat too close to the surface for what he was trying to grow there, and suggested a rotating system that would build that soil over 3 seasons. He listened carefully and did not dismiss any of it. He asked questions and she answered them, and he changed his approach, and she watched with quiet satisfaction as the results began to bear her out. She also, it turned out, was a remarkable hand with the cattle. She had an easy stillness around them that the animals responded to, and she could handle bell and corker without the steady stream of low conversation that Harlan used, just a particular quality of attention and patience that the horses seemed to find as reassuring as words. "You are good with animals," he told her one morning, watching her work with the lead cow in the yard. "Animals do not care what you look like," she said simply. "They care how you feel." He thought about that for the rest of the day. By the middle of the second month, she was no longer his guest in the way that word implies a temporary state. She was part of the farm in the way a load-bearing wall is part of a building, not decorative, not optional, but structurally necessary in a way that would be deeply and obviously felt if it were removed. They had not discussed this formally. Neither of them was a person who tended toward formal discussion of things that were already understood in practice. What they had instead were mornings at the outdoor table with camp coffee, evenings working side by side until the light went, long quiet stretches of compatible silence, and conversations that grew gradually longer and more ranging. About the war history between human settlements and orc clans that had made the frontier what it was, about the specific texture of grief, and what you do with it when the people who shaped you are gone. About what a person wants from a life that is genuinely and entirely their own. She told him about growing up in the clan. The clan's name was the Greenville, and they had lived in the Kettlehorn foothills for 4 generations, and she had been their best hunter by the time she was 20, and their head gardener Greca had been teaching her the seed keeping for 2 years before the Ashfall men came through. She was 23 years old. She had never lived outside the clan before those 2 days walking south. He told her about his father, a quiet, practical man named Emmett Holloway who had built the farm by hand and taught his son everything about construction and soil and patience, and who had died of a lung illness in the first winter Harlan spent alone, which had been the hardest season of his life. He was 26. He had not had a close friend, let alone anything else, since a girl in Ashford who had married someone else when he was 22, and had made it clear that the farm was too far from town for her tastes. This last piece he told Dura on a warm evening in the 3rd week, sitting on the front steps of the main house after supper. He had not talked about it in a long time and was mildly surprised by how easily it came out. "She was not wrong," he said. "The farm is far from town." "It is," Dura said from where she sat beside him on the step. "I like that about it." He looked at her sideways. "You do. Town is," she considered. "Town is where the Tomas Crays of the world live. Out here there is only the work and the land," and she stopped for a fraction of a second. "The company." He was quiet for a moment. "Yes," he said. "That is exactly right." They were sitting close on the step. The house steps were narrow, and there was not much room, and neither of them had moved to create more. Her shoulder was almost touching his. The evening was warm and the stars were beginning to come out over the valley, and the peepers in the creek were as loud as always, and he was aware of the warmth of her beside him as a specific, physical thing that was pleasant in a way that went considerably beyond the practicality of shared body heat on a cool evening. He did not move toward her. He was not a man who moved faster than the situation asked for, and besides, he did not entirely trust his read of the situation yet. But he did not move away either. She was the one who broke the silence. "In my clan," she said, "when someone saved your life, you were bound to them by the word debt. You could not leave until you had given back what you received. I did not save your life. You gave me a week when I was bleeding and had nowhere to go and was," she paused. "I was not in a good state, Harlan. You cannot have failed to notice that." "You were in a hard state," he said carefully. "That is different from a bad one." She turned her head to look at him, so close that he could see the particular pattern of her eyes in the starlight, not simply yellow-green but layered, amber at the center shading outward into green like light through deep water. "Word debt or not," she said, "I am not leaving. I want you to know that. It is not obligation. I have tried to find the obligation in it and I cannot locate it." He held her gaze. The feeling in his chest was large and very clear. "Good," he said. "I'm very glad to hear it. Something passed between them, that charged, careful thing that exists in the space between people who want to move closer and are both being honest about wanting to be sure. Then a barn owl called from the timber and they both blinked, and she looked back at the stars and he looked at his hands, and the moment sealed itself into memory and became part of the fabric of the farm. The trouble came in the 5th week. Harlan had ridden to Ashford for supplies: salt, lamp oil, a new file for the axe, and Dura had stayed at the farm, which they had both considered and agreed was the simpler option for now. Not because she could not go, but because Ashford was a market town with enough people and enough prejudice that going together would be a statement they were not sure they were ready to make publicly, and going alone might go worse for her than for him. He had been gone since early morning, and she was in the field, turning soil for a second planting of rye, when she heard horses on the north trail. Not one horse, multiple. The sound of deliberate travel. She straightened up and shaded her eyes and felt in the back of her chest a cold and very old recognition. There were 5 of them, coming down the trail from the north, and they were Orc men, Greenville, she thought, by the markings on their leathers, though the markings were dirty and partially obscured, and they looked like people who had been moving hard through rough country for weeks. The one in front was large even by Orc standards, with a gray-shot topknot and a jaw set with the permanent authority of a man who had led for a long time. She knew him. She had known him all her life. Dura, said Dura Ironhide, her father's older brother, her uncle. The relief of seeing a known face was so physical it nearly dropped her. She stood there holding the planting hoe for a moment that stretched long, and then she said his name and walked toward him, and he dismounted, and they met in the middle of the field with the particular embrace of people who had each spent weeks believing the other dead. There were 5 of them, Brack, and 2 younger men she recognized as cousins, and 2 she did not know Greenville by their markings, but from a different branch of the clan. They were thin and trail-worn, and they smelled of smoke and hard travel. She brought them water. She built a fire at the yard center and put on the largest pot and made the biggest batch of stew the farm's root cellar could provide, which was considerable. Brack sat across the fire from her and looked at the new building and the fields and the barn. "You found a human homestead," he said. The word human carried a complicated weight that she recognized, not hate exactly, but an accumulated caution that a lifetime of frontier history had written into the language. "I found more than that," she said. "The man who lives here is," she thought about how to say it, "he is a different kind of man." Brack's eyes moved to the new building, small and solid with its good door and its oiled window. "Built that? In a week, for me, because I had nowhere to sleep." Brack was quiet then. Greenville hospitality is not usually extended so quickly by a human on the frontier. No, it is not. When Harlan came home in the late afternoon, he rode into the yard and found 5 Orc strangers sitting around his fire, and he stopped Bell at the edge of the yard and took in the situation with the calm, assessing look of a man who is not going to make anything worse with a hasty reaction. Dura came to meet him. She was watching his face very carefully. "My uncle," she said, "and cousins and 2 others of the clan, they survived the Ashfall attack. They have been moving south since then, tracking the route anyone escaping east would have taken." He nodded once and dismounted and handed her Bell's reins without any ceremony and walked toward the fire. He stopped a respectful distance from Brack and stood straight and said, "I'm Harlan Holloway. This is my farm. You are welcome here. There is food if you need it." Brack looked at him for a long time with the particular look of someone taking extensive inventory. "You built her that building," Brack said. "She needed a place to be," Harlan said. "I had the materials." Another long, measuring silence. Then Brack said, "She says you are a different kind of man." "I wouldn't know," Harlan said. "I am just the kind I am." Something in the big Orc's expression shifted, not warmth exactly, not yet, but a kind of wary consideration that was the precursor to respect. "We will rest 2 days," Brack said. "Then we must move on. There are others to find and a new place to settle." "The East Meadow is yours while you need it," Harlan said. "I will bring more blankets from the house." He did. He did not make it a production. He just moved through the practicalities of the situation with the same plain, unhurried competence he brought to everything. And Dura watched him do it from the edge of the yard with her hand still resting on Belle's bridle, and felt something shift in her chest that was large and specific and had a direction. That night, sitting across the fire from her uncle and cousins, she listened to Brack talk about the plan. They were going northeast, toward a valley the Greenville's eldest knew that was unsettled and large enough for the remaining clan to establish new ground, and she felt the old pull of clan obligation tugging at her. She was Greenville. Her people needed every hand. But she also looked at the house across the yard, where Harlan's lantern was visible through the window as he moved inside doing the last tasks of the evening, and she felt a different pull, newer and deeper, with roots she had not noticed growing until they were already substantial. She did not sleep much that night. In the morning she found Harlan at the barn. He was doing the horse's morning care, and he did not look up when she came in, which she recognized as giving her the space to say what she needed to say without pressure. "My uncle wants me to go with them," she said. "He kept working." "I know. I heard him say so last night." She leaned against the barn wall. "He is not wrong. The Greenville need to rebuild. I know the seed keeping. I was trained for it." "Yes," Harlan said. "You were." A long silence. Belle pushed her nose into his shoulder and he absently rubbed it. "If I went," she said carefully, "I think I would be doing the right thing for my clan." "Yes," he said again. "And if I stayed," she stopped. He did look up then. The gray-green eyes met hers across the barn. "If you stayed," he said, "I would plant the east field in winter rye this fall and put the red clover along the south fence where the sun stays longest, like you told me. And I would put a door on the root cellar that does not stick in the frost." He paused. "And I would be very glad to have you here." She looked at him. The thing in her chest that had been growing roots for 5 weeks was entirely clear now. She knew what it was. She knew its weight and its shape. "I want to stay," she said. Not a tentative statement, a true one. His breath shifted, just slightly, but she caught it. "Then stay," he said. She told Brack that evening, sitting outside by the remains of the fire in the direct and undecorated way of someone who has made a genuine decision and is not looking for permission. Brack looked at her for a long time. The firelight moved on his weathered face. Then he said, "He is a good man. He is a very good man." "You are certain?" "I am certain of very few things, Uncle. I am certain of this." Another long silence. Then Brack reached into his coat and took out a small carved piece of bone, a Greenville clan marker, the kind given at a bonding ceremony, and held it out to her. "Then carry it properly," he said. "And when there are children, tell them where it came from." She took it with both hands, the formal Greenville way, and he put his large hand briefly over hers, and then stood up and walked to where his men were settling for the night. She sat with the bone carving in her hands for a long time, in the dark, in the warm smell of the cooling fire. She did not go to Harlan's door that night. Some things deserve their time. The 2 days of Brack's visit ended with their departure in the gray early morning, heading northeast with their horses and their supplies and the seeds Dura had given them. A portion of each, because the Greenville seed keeper's principle was that you always kept the parent strain and sent daughters of it forward. Brack clasped Harlan's arm in the orc-fashioned forearm-to-forearm grip firm before he mounted, and Harlan returned the grip without flinching, and she loved him for that, quietly and completely. When the riders were over the north hill and out of sight, she stood in the yard and felt the new quality of the silence, not loss, she found, or not only loss, but also something clean and certain. "Come help me with the east field," she said to Harlan. "I was just thinking the same thing," he said. The summer came on warm and steady over the Graymere Valley. The winter rye went in, her clan's strain, robust and dark-grained, and the clover established itself along the meadow edge with the patient certainty of something that intends to stay. Harlan's cattle grew heavy on the summer grass. The chickens remained anarchic and endearing, and she eventually solved the fence escape problem by adding an additional rail that Harlan said he had been meaning to add for 2 years but had never gotten around to, and which she did in a single afternoon while he was mucking the barn. He came out and looked at the new rail and then looked at her and said, "You just fixed my longest-running agricultural problem in an afternoon." "The chickens were not that complicated," she said. "They just wanted a taller barrier. I have a feeling," he said, "that you apply that principle to most problems." She considered this. "Give things what they actually need rather than what is convenient." "Yes." "Roughly. I am going to try to remember that," he said. "You already do it," she told him. "You just have not named it." He went quiet in the way he sometimes did when she said something that hit him at an angle he had not expected. She had come to treasure that quiet. It was not blankness. It was presence, full attention, the particular silence of a person who is actually listening. In the long evenings of midsummer, they sat on the front steps or the outdoor table and talked about everything, gradually, in the way that people do when they are not trying to impress each other and not afraid of what the other person will think, which is the most honest and the rarest kind of conversation. They talked about the frontier, about the war history, the cattle raids and the settlement burns, the cycles of distrust that had made the border country what it was, and whether it was possible for individual people to live in a different way inside that history. She told him more about the Greenville, their customs and their governance and their way of marking time by the growing seasons. He told her about the politics of Ashford, the town council, the land disputes, the particular way small frontier communities turned against whoever was easiest to blame when things went wrong. "Tomas Cray will come back," she said one evening, without particular alarm, just as a fact. "Probably," Harlan agreed, "he or someone like him." "What will you do?" He looked at her. "The same thing I did last time, stand between him and you and tell him to get off my land if he cannot be civil. You should not have to do that on my account. I should do it for all the same reasons I built the building, because it is the right thing and because he stopped." "Because," she prompted. He turned his cup in his hands. "Because you matter to me, Dura, very much." The summer night was loud with insects and the far sound of the creek. She looked at him in the lantern light from the table, and the feeling that had been building since the 7th day, since the door, since the step, since the morning in the barn was so immediate and so entirely clear that it took her breath in a way that was not entirely comfortable and entirely wonderful. "You matter to me too," she said. "More than is simple, more than I expected." He looked at her. "Since when?" She considered being careful about the answer. Then she decided not to be careful. "Since you handed me the measuring line," she said. "On the first morning. You just handed it to me without any speech about whether I knew what to do with it. You just handed it to me." Something happened in his face that she had not seen from him before. Something open and unguarded, like the expression she tried not to let happen in herself. "For me it was the laugh," he said. "On the 3rd day. You laughed at something I said and it was unexpected. And I knew that whatever happened, I was going to spend a significant portion of my energy trying to make that happen again." She felt warmth across her face. Orcs did not blush in the visible human way, but she felt the warmth. "Have you succeeded?" "More than I expected," he said, echoing her words back with a smile that was slow and real and private, and she felt the warmth spread further down to her chest, and thought that she was, perhaps, not as well armored as she had always believed herself to be. He reached across the table and put his hand over hers. It was slow and deliberate and entirely unhurried. The way he did everything, a question in physical form, giving her the full space to accept or not accept. She turned her hand over and her fingers closed over his, and his did the same, and they sat like that in the evening, not talking, the valley spreading out dark and star-bright below the farm, and it was one of the most complete silences she had ever sat in. The next morning, something had changed in the air between them. Not the carefully maintained working partnership that remained, because they were both fundamentally people who respected the structure of shared labor, but something additional, something warmer and less formal, that had been there in undeclared form for weeks and had now been, quietly, declared. He kissed her for the first time 2 evenings later. They had been in the small building, her building, because the fire in the main house hearth had been slow to draw and hers was burning well, and they had moved there after supper, sitting there without ceremony, as they had started to do in cooler evenings. They were seated on the low bench he had made for the hearth, close together in the way that bench and warmth naturally arranged people. She said something. She forgot almost immediately what it was because of what happened next, and he turned to look at her, and they were very close, and he looked at her for a long moment with that full, present attention, and then he leaned forward and kissed her. It was gentle. It was careful. It was the precise quality of attention and intention he brought to everything, not rushed, not uncertain, but deliberate and warm and honest. Her hand came up to his jaw without her deciding to do it, and she felt the rough texture of his jaw against her palm and the warmth of his mouth, and thought, quite clearly, that she had been expecting this for a long time. When they drew back slowly, he looked at her in the firelight and said, very quietly, "I have been thinking about doing that for some time." "I know," she said. "I have been thinking about doing it too. Why didn't you? You seemed like a man who needed to arrive at things in his own time." He laughed, a real, surprised laugh, warm and full, and she thought, that is the feeling he described. That is what I did to him on the 3rd day. She understood it now from the inside. "Fair," he said when the laughter settled. "Very fair." She kissed him back this time, and it was less tentative and more honest, and the fire crackled warm and the valley was dark outside the old window, and she did not go back to the main house that night. She stayed and he stayed, and they were not only working partners or neighbors or friends or grateful and grateful of, and the night was warm and private and entirely their own. Summer's warmth did not protect them from the world's edges. The real trouble arrived in August, on a market day when they had both ridden into Ashford together for the first time. A decision made simply and naturally because the supply list was long, and it was more efficient with 2 people. And also because they were long past the point of pretending that hiding their partnership was a strategy either of them was interested in maintaining. Ashford was a frontier market town with a dirt main street and a trading post, and a saloon, and a feed merchant, and a blacksmith, and about 300 permanent residents and twice that many transient workers on any given market day. It had seen orcs before, had done cautious business with Greenville traders in better years, but an orc woman walking down the main street with a human man, their horses shoulder to shoulder, their posture the easy, close posture of people who belonged together, was a more pointed thing than a trade visit. They had tied their horses at the post outside the trading post and were working through the supply list when they became aware, gradually, of the quality of attention around them. It was the kind of attention that starts as staring and moves toward muttering, and Dura had navigated that particular progression enough times in her life to recognize where it was heading. She kept her face neutral and her movements unhurried. Harlan at her side did the same. They were 3 items into the list when the man stepped in front of them. He was not Tomas Cray. Cray was unpleasant but not stupid. This man was younger, red-faced, clearly lit with market day whiskey at 11 in the morning, and backed by 2 friends who had the look of people who had decided to do something before they had thought it through. "You lost, Greenskin," he said. The Market Street noise continued around them. People were watching. Dura felt the old, cold calculation of someone assessing a situation's danger level. She was not afraid she had handled worse, but she was aware that she was on human ground in a human town, and she had seeds to buy, and she did not want blood on the street before noon. Harlan stepped forward. Not in front of her, he moved to her right, slightly ahead, putting himself between the drunk man and her, and his posture was absolutely still, not aggressive, but immovable. "She is with me," he said. "She is my partner, and we are doing our market shopping, and you are going to step aside." The drunk man looked at Harlan with the belligerent recalibration of someone who was hoping for an easier confrontation. A human man carrying water for an orc girl. That is something. It is not particularly, Harlan said. It is just a man shopping with his partner. Step aside. People were watching from the trading post steps, from the saloon doorway, from the street. A woman who had come out of the dry goods store stood with a bolt of cloth in her arms, watching. Tomas Cray stood near the feed merchant's entrance, Harlan noticed, watching with a more complicated expression than his usual simple displeasure. The frontier does not need, the drunk man started. The frontier needs people who can work and build and grow things, Harlan said, voice level and carrying in the way that calm voices do. She does all three better than most people I know. That is all the frontier needs to know about her. He held the man's gaze without blinking. Now step aside, please. We are wasting market time. There was a long moment that had a great deal in it. The crowd watching, the morning sun, the horses at the post, Dura standing at Harlan's right shoulder with her hands still and her jaw set and her yellow-green eyes very clear. The drunk man's friends exchanged a look that said the calculation was not working out the way they had envisioned. The drunk man stepped aside. It was not graceful or friendly, but it was movement. Harlan walked forward without further comment, and Dura walked at his side, and they completed their shopping without additional incident. But it was not nothing. The crowd had watched, and the town had seen, and a man had stood publicly in the street with an orc woman at his shoulder and made it clear, in front of everyone who was watching, what the arrangement was. At the dry goods store, the woman with the bolt of cloth, she turned out to be the proprietor, a gray-haired woman named Marta who had been in Ashford for 30 years, gave them a look as they came in. Then she said to Dura directly, "You need anything for your building. I have good oilcloth at a fair price." Dura looked at her for a moment and then said, "I would appreciate seeing it." They bought the oilcloth. They also bought the salt and the lamp oil and the file, and a small tin of glass putty that Harlan thought he could use to finally properly glaze the east window. They rode home through the afternoon with the pack horse loaded and the valley opening up ahead of them, wide and quiet under the summer sky. Halfway home, Dura said, "You did not have to do that." "I know," he said. "But I wanted him to hear it said plainly in public. You are my partner. That is not a secret or a question." She looked at him riding beside her, the afternoon light on his angular face, his easy posture in the saddle, the particular quality of calm he carried that she had decided was not absence of feeling but the opposite of it, such clear and settled feeling that there was no turbulence left over. "Harlan Holloway," she said, with great deliberateness. "Yes." She reached across the space between their horses and put her hand briefly on his arm. "You are a very good man." He put his hand over hers for a moment before the horses' paces separated them again. "You mentioned something like that before," he said. "It keeps proving to be true," she said. He smiled. It was the slow, private smile, the one she considered most specifically hers. The fall came on golden and enormous over the Graymere Valley. The winter rye was in the ground, established and strong, the Greenville strain proving itself exactly as she had promised, the heads thick and even. The clover had spread along the meadow edge with real determination. The squash had been a success beyond expectation, and she had saved the seeds carefully. In cloth pouches she hung above the hearth in her building to dry, the way Greca had taught her. The farm had changed with two sets of hands and two different bodies of knowledge at work on it. Not beyond recognition. It was still clearly and specifically Harlan's farm, with its solid barn and its log house, and its particular relationship to the valley and the mountains, but improved, deepened, more efficiently managed and more thoughtfully planted. A second person who fully understood the land and cared about it was a different thing from a hired hand or even a very willing helper. Dura understood this farm now the way she understood the clan grounds, in her hands and her feet, and her seasonal knowledge. On an October evening, sitting on the front steps in the last warmth of the year with a blanket across both their laps because the nights were becoming real, she said to Harlan, "I want to stay permanently." He turned to look at her. He had been expecting this conversation, she thought. He had the settled look of someone who has been waiting patiently for something to arrive. "How permanently?" he asked. "Entirely," she said, "if you will have me. I know we have not formally. I know there is no formal arrangement between us, and I am not asking for things to be faster than they should be, but I want to be honest about Dura," he said. She stopped. "I have been trying to find the right moment to ask you to stay," he said, "for about 6 weeks. I was not sure whether to say it plainly or find some more eloquent way of saying it. I have decided plainly is better." She looked at him. "Stay," he said. "This is your farm, too. It has been for months, whether we have named it or not." She took a breath that was slightly unsteady, which was not her usual mode. "In the Greenville tradition," she said, "a permanent bond is marked with the bone carving, which I already have from my uncle, and with the planting of a joint crop, something that neither person planted alone, that requires both of them to tend and harvest." "That is a good tradition," he said. "We have the rye, we did that together." "We did," she said. "In the human tradition in this part of the country," he said, "a permanent bond is marked at the town register. You sign your names together and the town has a record of it." "In Ashford," she said, "in front of Tomas Cray and all of them." "In front of all of them," he agreed. "Yes." She considered this. "All right," she said. He looked at her for a long moment, and then he took her hand and turned it over and pressed his lips to the inside of her wrist, which was not a thing he had done before, and she felt it all the way to the center of her chest. "All right," he echoed softly. They rode to Ashford on a clear November morning with the first frost still silver on the grass. They rode side by side, not talking much, with the comfortable ease of people who have worked out how to share space in the world. Dura wore her fitted leather bodice and her good wool cloak against the cold, and her braids were done properly, and she carried the Greenville bone carving in the small pouch at her belt. The Ashford town register was kept by a gray-bearded clerk named Ford, who had been doing the job for 20 years and had seen most things. He looked at them both over the top of his glasses when they came through the door, at Harlan, who he clearly knew, and at Dura, whom he was clearly taking inventory of, and then he put his glasses back in place and pulled out the register book. "Names," he said, "just that. Not welcome, not refusal. Names." "Harlan Emmett Holloway," Harlan said. "Dura Ironhide," Dura said. Ford wrote both names in careful copperplate. He pushed the book across the desk. They both signed, she in the angular, rune-influenced script of the Greenville, he in the plain frontier hand his father had taught him, and Ford noted the date, stamped the page, and tore out the copy. "Bound as of today," he said, handing Harlan the copy. "Congratulations to you both. Next." They came out onto the main street, and the autumn sun was sharp and cold, and a small crowd of people who had apparently been watching through the window were now watching from the street with various expressions ranging from disapproval to curiosity to, in the case of Marta from the dry goods store, something that looked genuinely like warmth. Tomas Cray was there. He was standing outside the feed merchants, as if the whole town were his porch, and he looked at Harlan and Dura coming down the register office steps with an expression that was complicated and layered, and ultimately, she thought, losing. Not lost. Men like Cray did not suddenly convert to goodwill, but losing, in the way that things that are wrong about the world eventually and slowly and imperfectly lose. Harlan stopped at the bottom of the steps and looked at Cray, not with challenge, just with the plain, level look of a man who is comfortable with what he has done. Cray opened his mouth. Then he closed it. He turned and went into the feed merchants without a word. Harlan and Dura stood on the Ashford Main Street in the November sun, and she took the copy of the register from him and looked at both their names written side by side in the official book, and felt the bone carving warm at her belt from her own body heat, and thought of Greca and the seeds and the burning camp, and the fence rail, and the measuring line and the door and the hearth and the summer evenings, and the hand over hers at the outdoor table, and the whole chain of it ran through her like a current. "Let us go home," she said. They rode home through the frost-bright afternoon, and the valley came up to meet them out of the lowering sun, and the farm sat on its small rise above the meadow with the winter rye dark and steady in the field, and the barn red against the pale sky, and the small building with its good door and its morning light window and its well-mortared hearth. And it was theirs, both of them, entirely. The first winter of their formal life together was hard the way all frontier winters are hard. The snow came deep through the Kettlehorn passes. The cold settled into the valley for months. The cattle needed constant tending, and the wood supply required daily management. But they were good at hard winters. They were both people who moved well under pressure, and they had complementary habits. Harlan woke early and did the outdoor chores in the worst cold before she was up, and she prepared food and managed the stores in the evening with the same seed-keeping precision she applied to everything. So nothing was wasted and nothing ran out. They lived in the main house together now, in the practical and unambiguous way of people who have chosen each other. Her building had become a proper workshop, and seed store the hearth was used for drying. The shelves were stocked with the carefully labeled pouches of the Greenville strains she was expanding. It was her space in the professional sense, and she went to it every day, and it was good. In the evenings they sat by the main house fire. She had brought a Greenville craft into the house, a way of braiding rushes into pattern mats, something the clan had used for both floor covering and trade, and she made them steadily through the winter evenings while he read or repaired things. The mats she finished became, gradually, a feature of the house, warm and intricately patterned. In geometric forms that had specific Greenville meanings she explained to him over the winter evenings, and he listened to every one. He learned the Greenville symbols for soil and growth and harvest and clan and bond. She taught him what each pattern meant, and he traced them in the rushes slowly, learning the craft with the same patient intelligence he applied to everything structural. By midwinter, he could make a serviceable border pattern, which she declared a real accomplishment, and he accepted with genuine pleasure. In the deep cold of January, when the snow was high against the door and the fire was banked full, and the world outside was completely still and white, they were close in the way people become when they share a small, warm space against the cold, and she thought that the frontier had given her a very strange and very particular gift, to be where the world was hardest and find within it the thing that was most warm. She thought about Greca a great deal in the winter, about what the old gardener would have made of the Holloway farm, the rye in the ground, the seed pouches drying above the hearth. She thought Greca would have said, "Well, girl, you kept the seeds." She thought that would have been enough. By spring of the first year of their formal partnership, word had moved through the frontier network, the wagon trails, the trading posts, the messages passed at market in the particular, layered way that news does in border country. The Holloway farm, the human man and the orc woman, the Greenville seeds and what they had done to the winter rye yield, the building he had put up in a week. The way he had stood on the Ashford Street and said, "She is my partner," plainly, in front of everyone. People talked about it in the way they talk about things that unsettle their categories and force them to consider revisions. Some were hostile, but some more than she had expected, particularly among the frontier working people who judged largely by whether a person could work and whether they meant what they said. Some were thoughtful. Marta from the dry goods store sent word in March that she was interested in stocking the Greenville rush mats for trade. This was not nothing. It was Ashford's longest established merchant telling the town, in the market language that carried more weight than any verbal declaration, that the Holloway farm was a legitimate and valued part of the local economy. Dura rode in herself to negotiate the arrangement. She rode alone, on the horse Harlan had let her choose from the two he kept at the farm, Corker, the bay, who was calmer and more sensible than Belle in unfamiliar situations. She sat across a table from Marta in the dry goods store, and they talked trade in the direct, practical manner of two women who both understood value and neither of whom was interested in wasted time. When she came home with the trade agreement, Harlan listened to the terms she described and said, That is a better arrangement than she gives most people. I know, Dura said. I made sure of it. He grinned. Good. They celebrated with a bottle of apple brandy from the cellar that had been waiting for a specific occasion, and sat up late by the fire talking about what the trade income could do for the farm: more seed stock, another draft animal, possibly a proper glass pane for the east window of her building, which had been on the list since the beginning. She bought the glass pane in June. She fitted it herself, with the putty she had purchased in the fall, and when the last edge was set and dry, she stood back and looked at it in the afternoon light: real glass, clear and solid, letting in the east morning light the way a good window should, and she thought of Harlan measuring it out in the rough sketch by lantern light on the second morning, thought to give it morning light, and she loved him with a specificity and depth that was entirely unlike anything she had expected to find in the world. Let alone on a fence rail bleeding, on a frontier farm, 600 miles south of everything she had known. In the summer of the second year, she was pregnant. She told him in the morning at the outdoor table directly, the way she said all important things. He sat very still for a moment. Then he looked at her with an expression she had never seen from him before, layered and open and overwhelmed in the best possible way, like a man who has been handed something whose value he cannot immediately process. How are you? He asked. I am very well, she said. Orcs carry more easily than humans as a rule. Grekville tradition says the morning of the fourth season is the right time to plant, and here we are. She paused. I am telling you first. He stood up and came around the table and knelt in front of her chair and took both her hands in his. A half-orc child, he said, on this farm, in this valley. That is the plan, she said. He turned her hands over and pressed his lips to her knuckles, and she felt the full weight of what they had built pressing warmly against her from all sides. The farm, the valley, the register book, the bone carving, the seeds in the ground, the mat patterns on the floor, the door with its good iron latch, all of it. And it was so large and so real that she put her hand in his hair and held on, not with grief this time, but with joy, which was its own kind of overwhelm. The child was born in early spring, with the valley still showing the last of the snow in the north-facing hollows, and the first green pushing up through the meadow. The birth was attended by a midwife from Ashford, a practical woman named Yenna who had some experience with orc births and, more importantly, had no patience for nonsense. And it went well, as Greenville births tended to go, though not easily, because nothing entirely worthwhile is entirely easy. The child was a boy. He was born with the particular gray-green skin that sat between his parents' colors, with his father's angular jaw and his mother's luminous, amber-centered eyes. He was large, as half-orc babies tend to be, and he arrived with a decisiveness that Yenna said she had not seen in 20 years of midwifery, which Dura thought was probably genetic. Harlan held him in the crook of his arm in the first hour, with the careful concentration of someone entrusted with something infinitely precious, and looked at him for a long time without saying anything. He has your eyes, Dura said, from where she was lying propped on the pillow, watching her husband watch their son. He has your jaw, Harlan said. My jaw, that particular set of the jaw, like he has already decided something. She laughed, tired and warm and completely alive. We should write to Brack, she said. He will want to know. I will send word tomorrow, Harlan said. He looked up at her. Name, she had thought about it carefully. She had a Greenville name in mind and a frontier name in mind, and she had been keeping them separate, waiting to see which felt right when the moment arrived. Emmett, she said. Emmett Greenville Holloway. His face did something large and quiet. Greenville. A Greenville word. It means the one who keeps the seeds whole. He looked down at the baby, who had the calm, evaluative expression of someone newly arrived and taking stock of the situation. Emmett Greenville Holloway, Harlan said. That is a very good name. Brack came south with 2 other Greenville in the late summer of that year, when the valley was at its fullest green, and the rye was heavy in the field. He came not in trouble or transit, but in the specific way of a man making a formal kin visit, with gifts and formal clothing and the particular deliberateness of ceremony observed properly. He met his great-nephew for the first time in the yard of the Holloway farm, in the afternoon sun, with the cattle grazing in the meadow and the chickens being anarchic in the background. He held Emmett Greville in his enormous arms with a gentleness that looked strange and was entirely natural, and he looked at the baby's gray-green face and the amber-centered eyes and the set jaw, and then he looked at Harlan. "You did good," he said, with the economy of a man who does not say things he does not mean. "We did," Harlan said. Brack's mouth moved in what was, for Brack, a broad smile. He transferred the baby back to Dura with ceremony, and then he and Harlan sat at the outdoor table with cups of camp coffee and talked for the better part of an afternoon about farming and soil and the frontier politics of the Northeast Valley where the Greenville had reestablished, and she listened from the doorway and thought, "This is it. This is what it looks like when the world is getting better. It does not look like a great event or a declaration. It looks like two men at a table with coffee, talking about what the ground needs. The years move the way good years do, not slowly and not fast, but fully, each season bringing its own work and its own particular satisfactions." The farm grew and deepened. The East Field went entirely to the Greenville rye strain, which had proved itself season over season, and which Harlan now traded at a premium through Marta's dry goods network. The seed store in Dura's building expanded to take up half the space, with careful labeled pouches on their pegs, and a record book she kept in both Greenville script and Frontier Common, cataloging the strains and their characteristics and their histories. She had named it, privately, the Greca Collection. She had not told Harlan this until the third winter, when she was showing him the record book by firelight, and he turned to the first page and read the dedication she had written there. He put the book down carefully and looked at her. "I think Greca would have liked this farm," he said. She pressed her lips together for a moment. "She would have said the soil could use more bone meal, and what are you planting there, girl, that will never hold?" He smiled. "And then she would have shown you exactly how to fix it." "And then she would have shown me exactly how to fix it," Dura agreed. Yes. A second child came in the fourth year. A daughter this time, with her mother's green skin and her father's gray-green eyes and a head of dark hair that came in curling, which neither of them knew the source of and both of them found entirely charming. She was named Greca Emmeline Holloway, and she arrived with the same decisive quality as her brother, and from almost the beginning it was clear that she had inherited, with full force, her mother's particular gift for reading the ground. By the time Emmett Greville was 6 years old and Greca Emmeline was 2, the Holloway farm had a reputation that extended from the Ashford Valley to the Kettlehorn trading posts and south along the river road as far as the next settlement. Not a famous reputation. This was not a story that ended up in chronicles or in the mouths of traveling bards, but a real one, the kind built from the accumulation of seasons and fair dealings and good seed, and the specific kind of integrity that comes from people who mean what they say and say what they mean. The frontier did not stop being difficult. There were still Tomas craze in the world, still moments when the old distrust flared, still times when Dura walked into a room and felt the familiar, exhausting weight of being looked at as a category rather than a person. But she had something now that she had not had in those first days on the fence rail, a ground to stand on, built and planted and tended by herself, and the man who had handed her the measuring line without ceremony, and the weight of a farm that bore her name alongside his in the registry, and children who moved through the world carrying both things in their faces and their hands. In the autumn of the 5th year, Harlan put up a new sign at the farm gate. He made it himself, from a good piece of cedar he had been keeping, and she watched him carve it without asking what it said. When he was done, he took it to the gate and hung it where the old fence plank had been. It read, HOLLOWAY Farm, Dura and Harlan, HOLLOWAYEST, year of the GREYVEIL rye. She stood at the gate and read it twice. Then she looked at him. Year of the Greyville rye, she said. It was the year we planted it together, he said. It seemed like the right marker. She put her hand flat against the cedar sign, feeling the carved letters. The morning light was on the valley, the kind of October light that was thin and gold and made every edge sharp, and the rye field was dark and established below the house, and the two children were in the yard behind them arguing pleasantly about something. And the farm, their farm, was as solid and real and particular as anything she had ever touched. She had been 19 days in the Kettlehorn country before she found the fence. She had been bleeding and afraid, though she would not have admitted the afraid. She had come to the end of her resources in the particular way that happens to people who have been trying very hard for a very long time and have finally come to the edge of what trying can hold. She had gripped the fence rail with the last of what she had, and a man with gray-green eyes had come out of his field and said, "You need water," and handed her the measuring line and built her a door, and stood between her and the world and made it clear, plainly and publicly, what the arrangement was. She turned from the sign and found him watching her in the autumn light with the particular look that was most specifically hers, the slow, private warmth that had belonged to her since the third day, since the laugh. "I love you," she said, not for the first time, but with the full weight of 5 years of farming and 2 children and the Greenville rye and the hearth mortar and the bone carving and the register book behind it, with all the accumulated specificity of a life genuinely and entirely chosen. "I love you," he said in the same full way. She went to him the way she did everything, directly, without detour, and he put his arms around her and held her in the morning light with the farm behind them and the children's voices in the yard and the mountains going gray and early snow on the horizon. And it was, she thought, exactly what a life was supposed to be when it was working right. She had carried seeds through fire. She had kept them whole. And here, in the end and the beginning and all the full and ordinary days between, was where they had grown. The farm was rich with them, and so was she.